Okay, this lecture will cover voting, campaigns, and election with a focus on Texas elections, but we'll talk a little bit about kind of the national perspective as well. So originally, the US Constitution delegated almost all power to the states to determine voter eligibility, voter registration. States still have a lot of flexibility, but what we have seen is kind of increasing federal guidelines and increasing federal oversight of state elections. But you can see when the country was very young, that first census that was taken, only about 5% of the citizens were eligible to vote because states had so many restrictions on voter registration. So states like Massachusetts and the early colonies had things like church membership requirements, property ownership requirements in order to vote or run for office. And so these are some of the first restrictions that are going to get removed or struck down by the courts. In some cases, the states would just do it willingly and they would remove those. But basically, by the 1830s, you no longer had to be a member of a church or own property in order to vote. But you don't really see the next wave of voting changes happen until post-Civil War. Remember when we talked about the Texas constitutions, in order to get back into the Union, the states all had to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, basically guaranteeing citizenship if you're born in the country and guaranteeing the right to vote if you were naturalized, right? If you became a citizen, even after birth. Again, this is in the news lately because President Trump has threatened and proposed, attempts to remove birthright citizenship for undocumented immigrants. But again, that'll have to be played out in the courts most likely. We also passed the 15th Amendment, on paper, at least guaranteeing the rights of all men to vote regardless of race, right? So this allowed men that weren't white to vote. But as we know, many southern states tried to prevent that through a number of practices, including poll taxes. They won't be removed until the 1960s. But in 1913, we did expand voters' right to elect U.S. senators directly. Previously, again, they were elected by state legislature. So this gave the voters more control over the Senate. Women gained the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And suffrage includes not just the right to vote, but also the right to run for office. In fact, some states actually allowed women to vote and run for office before the 19th Amendment, but this made it official nationwide. 1924, you see the passage of the Indian Citizen Act, recognizing Native American rights, including the right to vote for president and other elected offices. Now, during the 60s, you see this civil rights movement taking shape, and Washington, D.C. actually gets on board. Previously, residents in Washington, D.C. did not have the right to vote for president, did not have any voice in the U.S. House of Representatives. But in 1963, there is the passage of the 23rd Amendment, which did give Washington, D.C. The ability to vote in the Electoral College. They get 3 votes, which is basically like the smallest state in the country, even though DC has more citizens, more voters than a lot of the other states. They're basically treated as the smallest state, and they do get some say in the president. Now, in the civil rights movement, we did pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but the 24th Amendment actually ends the poll tax in federal elections. It says states can no longer charge people to vote, which was part of the Jim Crow practices that try to prevent lower income and also minority voters from participating. But in 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act, which goes a long way in giving more federal oversight. Excuse me. Federal oversight of state elections. Basically, what it does is it creates a process called pre-clearance. So this was the rest of the country through the legislature telling southern states that we do not trust you to do the right thing. Southern states like Texas have shown a history of continual discrimination. And so pre-clearance is basically designed to prevent discrimination in voting before it happens. So what that means is any state that was under pre-clearance had to prove that their laws and maps, right, redistricting maps, which we'll talk about later when we get to the Texas legislature, don't discriminate. Before they could go into effect, they would basically have to go before the federal courts and the Justice Department and make a case that these are fair elections, are not going to discriminate against voters of color. And so basically they had to come up with a test. How do you determine which states have to go under pre-clearance? So basically the Congress came up with this idea that if you have a literacy test and less than 50% voter registration. Sorry, I'm looking for my percentage. Then you had a means to prevent people from voting, and it was in fact preventing people from voting. So any state that met this test would have to go under pre-clearance, and that included Texas. And this lasted for decades. Southern states like Texas kept challenging it, saying that this wasn't fair. The courts kept upholding pre-clearance, but they started to warn Congress that you need a new test. You have to prove that these are still currently necessary. And so basically in 2013, a county in Alabama called Shelby County sued the Obama administration, and basically the courts struck this down. It's basically called Shelby County versus Holder. Eric Holder was Obama's attorney general at the time, so he was the one arguing in favor of pre-clearance. So basically now, after Shelby County, no state is under pre-clearance. So what that means is states don't have to prove that their laws don't discriminate, their maps don't discriminate. It's basically up to civil rights groups to challenge them in court. And currently that's happening. Basically, the Texas maps that were passed in 2021 have been challenged as discriminatory, as watering down the power of African Americans to elect representatives from their district, and some Hispanic groups also joined that cause as well. So the Voting Rights Act gave the federal government much more power to go into the South, to register African Americans to vote, to oversee elections, and to monitor polling locations to make sure that voter intimidation wasn't happening. But a lot of that has been kind of watered down by the recent court. There was another ruling in 1966 that further restricted poll taxes and banned them from state elections as well as federal elections. And I'll maybe bring this up, how it relates to some current laws today. But we saw further expansion of the voting rights in 1971. This was during the height of the Vietnam War, kind of towards the end of that war. With passage of the 26th Amendment, the United States lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. And this basically allowed, younger voters, especially men who might be drafted and sent to war, to have a say in the election where previously they didn't. The last real expansion of the voting rights was in 1986 when the United States expanded and enhanced the ability for military personnel or citizens living overseas to cast absentee ballots in elections in the United States, even if they're not on American soil. Now, states still have a lot of flexibility when it comes to voter registration. And Texas is one of the strictest states when it comes to voter registration and also voting in general. So in Texas, you do have to register in person or by mail on an actual voter registration form, we do not allow online voter registration, except in the more narrow purposes. The courts have ruled that Texas must allow voter registration if you are allowed to renew your driver's license online. Sometimes when you go to renew your driver's license, you have to go in and take another eye exam or take an updated picture. But if the state says that you are eligible to renew online, basically you can update your voter registration information at that time, but that's really the only exception to this rule. Like most states, you do have to be a U.S. citizen and 18 years old on election day to register to vote, even though you can register a couple months ahead of the election if you're 17. But in Texas, you have to register 30 days before the election. This is basically the federal maximum. States cannot allow you, or excuse me, cannot require you to register more than 30 days before the election, but they can allow you same day voter registration. If you look here, voter registration deadlines vary. South Carolina and Alaska require you to register. The election was on November 5th. So you had to register as early as October 6th in those states, but Texas and most other states were October 5th. So we're pretty close to that federal deadline. You can see the states in pink give you a little bit longer, and some states actually allow you to register same day. And some states actually are doing away with voter registration completely, which I'll talk about more in a second. In Texas, you also have to register with the county. Even though the Secretary of State oversees elections and voter registration, they maintain the voter registration rolls. You're actually registering with the county, and you have to be a resident of the county that you are registering in for that 30-day window as well. Now, you also have to be a resident of the precinct you're voting in on election day. We talked a little bit about precinct maps when we did the lecture on parties. I also mentioned this early in the semester, right? If you are convicted of a felony in Texas, you cannot vote until you have completely finished your felony sentence. You cannot be on probation or parole. You cannot owe the state any restitution or fines. And the penalty for voting, if you are still a convicted felon in Texas, is 5 years jail time. Straight to jail, right back to jail if you try to vote as a felon. Even if you vote unknowingly, in some cases, if you didn't know that you weren't supposed to vote, the state sometimes will even go after you then. Now, technically, once you register to vote, you shouldn't be required to register every election. Your registration should be permanent, and you shouldn't have to take any further action unless you move counties or you move residences. Then you probably need to update your voter registration information. But the state of Texas, through the Secretary of State's office, can verify your registration if they think you might have moved, or if they think perhaps you're dead, or maybe you've been convicted of a felony. They can send you a verification request, and if you fail to respond to that verification, and if you fail to vote in the election and update your information, they can put you on a suspense list. And if you don't vote, then they can actually remove you or scrub you from the voter registration roll. So it is your responsibility, once you register to vote, but well before the 30-day deadline, you need to go to the Secretary of State's website, just verify that you are still registered to vote. And if you've moved, you need to update that information. So voter registration deadlines vary from state to state. Some states will actually let you register online. In fact, most states allow online voter registration. You can see the ones in gray are like Texas. They do not allow online voter registration, but they'll also have cutoff dates for online registration if they do allow that. This one shows you that some states have started to incorporate automatic voter registration, meaning you don't have to do anything. The state has a secure database and a program that will automatically register you to vote without any action of your own. You can see there's 8 states plus DC will have this option. Some states have partial automatic registration, meaning it might take some action on your account. So it's not quite as rigorous. But you can see 26 states, including Texas. Currently, for the 2024 election, right, the previous election did not have automatic registration, but New Mexico and Michigan have passed automatic voter registration that will take effect this year and should be in effect in 2026. North Dakota, I mean, there's honestly not a ton of voters there, but our voter registration in North Dakota. So every state is going to be different in terms of their registration process. Now, Texas was one of the first states to pass a voter identification law. We were trying to pass this under the Obama administration, but the Obama administration was basically blocking states like Texas from passing voter ID laws because they argued that it discriminated. Right, against poor voters and minority voters, also older voters. These groups tend to be more likely to not have an ID or a valid ID. But ultimately, after Shelby County was handed down and pre-clearance was ended, Texas was allowed to go ahead and move forward with the voter identification law. So Texas does accept a wide variety of IDs. You can see the list, your ID, your driver's license. You can actually go to the DPS and get a personal ID, even if you cannot drive. You can still get an identification card. And the state will actually, if you are low income and below a certain, if you're below the poverty line, the state will actually provide that free of charge. One of the reasons they do this is because people who were against the voter identification laws basically said that this is a form of a poll tax, right? That it's going to impose some burden, some cost on low-income voters. And so in order to counter that argument, the state just decided, hey, look, we will pay you, we'll give you a free ID. You still need to take the time to travel to the DPS office. You go through that process. And then maybe if you don't have a transportation, you can't get off work, or you don't have childcare, that can be a big pain in the ass. But that's what the state did to try to counter the idea of a poll tax. If you have a license to carry a firearm or a passport, military ID, citizenship certification with a photo, all those would be accepted for a valid form of voter ID. But Republicans are typically going to argue that we need a voter ID to protect the integrity of the vote. We want to make sure that people aren't impersonating other people and having an impact on election. But in all honesty, this is very rare to see in-person voter fraud. The penalty for voter fraud, again, is 5 years in jail. So the idea that somebody's going to risk 5 years in jail to go cast a single ballot or maybe impersonate multiple people, receiving multiple felony sentences is not likely. So Democrats are typically argue that this is a solution in search of a problem. There's really no problem with voter impersonation, and that Republicans are passing this to try to prevent certain people from voting, but the courts have upheld this. The court does allow Texas and other states to impose strict voter ID laws. Texas is not quite as strict as other states because Texas does have a workaround. You can see about 10 states in 2020 or 2024 had a very strict voter ID law. If you didn't have an ID, you could not vote. That increased. It actually went up from 2020 to 24. 4 additional states passed those laws. So about 50 million potential voters would be subject to those laws. But in Texas, there is a workaround. If you don't have your ID, basically you can sign an affidavit, which is a legal document declaring that you are who you say you are, and giving a reason why you don't have an ID. And they'll try to match that information up. So there is a process to vote in Texas if you don't have an ID. Some states don't require any ID, right? And some states will accept a non-photo ID. This is how it used to be in Texas. You could show like a utility bill, or a water bill, something like that with your, a tax, your property taxes. something like that with your name on it, and they would let you vote. But you're seeing states are starting to get more strict on voter ID laws.